When you begin to redefine fulfillment, you also redefine your standards for connection. You stop accepting relationships that ask you to shrink. You become less willing to trade authenticity for attachment. You're no longer looking for someone to complete you, but to complement the life you've already been building. And yes, it may be quieter sometimes. It may go unnoticed in a culture that celebrates milestones like engagements over inner peace. But it is a life of integrity, of alignment, and of freedom. A life where your value is not contingent on someone else's desire. A life where you are not waiting to be chosen. You are choosing yourself again and again with intention. So if you've never had a long-term relationship, if you're single at 40, and if people assume you must be unfulfilled, let them assume. You know the truth. You know what you've cultivated. You know what it costs to live in alignment. And that's a deeper kind of success, one that doesn't always come with public validation, but offers something far more precious: peace. It's easy to feel like time is running out when it comes to love. At 40, especially if you've never had a relationship last longer than 5 months, the cultural noise can get louder. You start hearing the subtle warnings. Maybe you're too set in your ways. Maybe you've missed your window. Maybe the kind of love you want just doesn't exist anymore. And without realizing it, you begin to internalize those messages, not just as social commentary, but as personal truth. But let's pause here, because that kind of thinking, though common, is not only defeatist, it's inaccurate. There's a myth embedded in our collective consciousness that love is something that's meant to happen early, and that if it doesn't, your chances diminish with every passing year. But this myth has little to do with the emotional reality of intimacy, and everything to do with social norms built around reproduction, image, and timelines that were never designed for individual growth or inner truth. The truth is, love does not run on a schedule. It doesn't follow linear progression. Emotional readiness isn't something you age into automatically, and intimacy doesn't necessarily deepen just because a relationship lasts longer. Real love, the kind that requires vulnerability, presence, and mutual respect, often arrives after we've learned who we are without it. So if your story hasn't included lasting partnership yet, it doesn't mean your story is broken. It might mean that the most important parts of your story have been happening before the relationship, not inside of it, and that's something we rarely celebrate. In fact, one of the most hopeful and powerful things you can do at 40 is stay open, not in a passive, let's see what happens kind of way, but with active curiosity. To be available to love from a place of maturity, not urgency, because there's a difference between being ready for love and being available to it. Readiness is about having done the work on yourself, your patterns, your wounds. But availability is about trust. Trusting that connection is still possible, that you're still capable of being moved, that your heart, after all these years of solitude, of starts and stops, still wants to reach for something true. That's not naive, that's courage. Staying open after years of disappointment is one of the most radical acts of emotional resilience there is. It means you haven't let cynicism calcify your spirit. It means you believe, despite everything you've experienced, that intimacy is still worth the risk. And it is a risk. Let's be honest about that. Letting someone into the quiet, complex world you've built alone requires vulnerability. It's easier, in some ways, to protect what you've cultivated by not inviting anyone else in. But easier isn't the same as better. Imagine for a moment that we treated romantic relationships the same way we treat education or career development. We would never say someone who took a little longer to graduate is less intelligent, or that someone who hasn't landed their dream job by 40 is inherently unworthy of success. Yet when it comes to love, the timeline becomes strangely rigid. There's a powerful and pervasive belief that by a certain age, let's say 40, you should have already secured a long-term relationship, a stable partnership, maybe even a marriage, children, and a matching Instagram highlight reel. When those things don't materialize, especially when you've never had a relationship last more than 5 months, the silence around it becomes deafening, not just in the conversations we have with others, but in the questions we start to ask ourselves. Why haven't I had that yet? Is something wrong with me? This is where I want to challenge what I call the tyranny of timelines. We've been sold a very linear chronological story about love. It goes something like this. You date in your 20s, settle down by your 30s, and by 40, you should have achieved what culture broadly defines as romantic success. This narrative is so deeply internalized that many people don't even realize they're living under its pressure. It's not questioned, it's assumed. But assumptions, especially the ones we don't interrogate, have the most power over us. Let's step back. What exactly are we measuring when we say someone hasn't had a long-term relationship? Is time really the best metric? 5 months versus 5 years. What does that tell us about depth, intimacy, or even the quality of connection? You can be profoundly lonely in a 10-year relationship. You can also experience transformative emotional growth in 5 months with the right person, but society doesn't give you credit for that because wambogad. And we often value isn't depth, it's duration, not the internal experience, but the external optics. This is particularly misleading when we consider how people develop emotionally. Psychological maturity is not a synchronized process. Some of us start examining our patterns, our wounds, our attachment styles much earlier or later than others. Some avoid relationships because they sense, perhaps unconsciously, that they're not yet ready to engage in a way that's healthy or sustainable. That's not dysfunction, that's discernment. It's an awareness that love is not a game of endurance, and being in a long relationship doesn't mean you're necessarily good at relationships. It might just mean you're good at staying. Now, I'm not diminishing long-term partnerships. They can be beautiful, nourishing, and deeply meaningful. But we have to stop making them the only story that counts. Not everyone is on the same timeline. Not everyone is even playing the same game. And yet we pathologize people who don't fit this narrative. We make them feel like late bloomers at best, or defective at worst. That's not only unkind, it's intellectually lazy. Think about how many people stay in unhappy or even harmful relationships simply because they don't want to be single. They're more afraid of solitude than stagnation. That's not connection, that's codependence. But our culture rewards longevity over authenticity. We give gold stars for sticking it out, not for knowing when to walk away. So what happens to the person who chooses not to settle, who would rather be alone than be in the wrong relationship? They become invisible in the cultural narrative. Or worse, they become suspect. They must be too picky, too damaged, too intense. But here's the thing. What if those 5-month relationships were a kind of deep training ground? What if the person who hasn't yet had a long relationship has spent that time doing something most people avoid? Looking inward, building self-awareness, working on emotional fluency. These skills don't always show up as a happy couple in a holiday photo. They show up in the quiet dignity of someone who knows their worth, who isn't looking for a partner to rescue them or complete them. That's not failure, that's wisdom. We need to update our metrics for romantic success. Instead of asking, how long have you been together? Maybe we start asking, how are you growing together? Or even more radically, what did you learn about yourself in that time? The goal is not simply to be in a relationship. It's to be in the right one. And sometimes the right relationship takes longer to find, not because you're broken, but because you're becoming someone who refuses to settle for less than real connection. When we challenge the assumption that love must arrive on a culturally approved schedule, we make space for something far more meaningful: agency, the freedom to choose how and when we connect without shame. Because intimacy isn't measured by the calendar, it's measured by courage, the courage to know yourself, to be honest about what you want, and to wait for something that honors both. So if you're single at 40 and have never had a relationship last beyond 5 months, maybe the real story isn't about what's missing. Maybe it's about what you've been building quietly all along: clarity, strength, and the capacity to love with intention when the time is right. When people hear that you've never had a relationship last more than 5 months, especially at 40, the first assumption often isn't curiosity, it's concern. There's a subtle but persistent suggestion that something said be wrong with you. Either you're emotionally unavailable, too damaged, too demanding, or maybe just not trying hard enough. And this assumption, whether it's spoken or just implied, carries a dangerous weight. It implies that the absence of a long-term partner is a symptom of personal deficiency. But what if we flip the question? What if, instead of asking what's wrong, we asked what's real? Understanding why relationships haven't lasted is an important inquiry, but it's one that needs to be approached without shame, because shame shuts down reflection. It keeps us in performance mode, trying to fix ourselves in order to be more palatable, more lovable, more whatever we think others expect of us. But when we approach our relational history with curiosity instead of criticism, something else opens up: clarity, not just about what hasn't worked, but about what we're actually looking for. Some people avoid relationships not because they're incapable of love, but because they have a deep, often unspoken, fear of what intimacy demands: vulnerability, unpredictability, a surrender of control. The philosopher Alain de Botton once wrote that we don't fall in love with those who make us happy. We fall in love with those who feel familiar. That familiarity, for many of us, is shaped by early attachment experiences, how we were seen, soothed, or perhaps neglected and misunderstood as children. These experiences don't just vanish with age, they form templates. They become the silent architects of our adult relationships. So if your relationships haven't lasted long, it might not be because you're too difficult to love. It might be that you're unconsciously drawn to people who confirm your internal beliefs about love. For example, if love always felt conditional growing up, you might now gravitate toward people who are emotionally inconsistent, who activate that anxious loop of, if I just do a little more, maybe I'll finally be enough. And if relationships feel threatening or overwhelming, you might find comfort in the initial spark of connection, but feel a need to retreat once emotional intensity grows. That's not sabotage, that's protection. And protection isn't failure, it's information. It's your nervous system doing exactly what it's designed to do: keep you safe. The problem is, sometimes the strategies we use to stay safe in the short term keep us stuck in the long term. We avoid conflict to preserve harmony, but end up never being truly known. We downplay our needs to seem easygoing, but slowly starve ourselves of intimacy. Or we walk away early, not because we don't care, but because staying would mean confronting the parts of ourselves we're still afraid to show. These are not character flaws, they are coping strategies. And when we recognize them as such, we can begin to shift from judgment to awareness. We can ask deeper questions like, what patterns do I keep repeating? What kinds of people am I drawn to? And what do those choices reflect about how I see myself? Where am I protecting myself from pain in ways that also block connection? Therapy, introspection, books, podcasts, deep conversations with trusted friends, these are all part of the work. And it is work. Not glamorous, not always visible, but absolutely vital. Because you cannot build a strong foundation for love if you don't understand the terrain of your own emotional landscape. This doesn't mean we get stuck in endless self-analysis either. The goal isn't to become perfectly healed before entering a relationship. That's a myth. None of us are finished products. The goal is to develop enough self-awareness to engage with another person from a place of integrity and responsibility. To say, here is who I am, here are my wounds, here is where I'm growing. Can we build something together, knowing neither of us is whole, but both of us are willing? So yes, maybe your longest relationship has been 5 months, but maybe those 5 months taught you more about your patterns, your fears, your longings than a 5-year relationship built on avoidance ever could. And maybe the fact that you're still asking questions, still reflecting, still seeking to understand rather than just perform, maybe that's the most meaningful relationship work of all. Understanding why things haven't worked out yet doesn't mean blaming yourself or rewriting your story as a tragedy. It means owning your journey with honesty and grace. You can't rewrite the past, but you can change how you relate to it. And from that place, you begin to choose differently, not out of desperation, not to prove something, but because you've earned the clarity that only self-inquiry can bring. One of the most liberating and yet most uncomfortable truths we can face is that fulfillment doesn't have to come wrapped in the form of a romantic partner. And yet, this idea runs counter to almost everything we're taught. From childhood fairy tales to adult films and even casual conversations with well-meaning friends, we are saturated with the message that love, specifically romantic love, is the pinnacle of human experience. That without it, you are somehow living a life that is partial, incomplete, waiting to begin. But what if that isn't true? What if the belief that a romantic relationship is the central structure of a meaningful life is actually limiting our capacity for connection and depth rather than expanding it? We don't often realize how romantic love has been culturally elevated to something bordering on spiritual salvation. It's become the container where we expect to find everything: passion, safety, companionship, personal growth, healing, validation, and purpose. That's a lot of weight for one person or one relationship to carry. And when we don't have that relationship, we feel the absence not just as loneliness, but as inadequacy. But here's the reality. A full life is not a reward for those who get it right in love. It's a possibility available to anyone who is willing to engage deeply with the world, regardless of their relationship status. That includes the single person at 40 who has never had a long-term relationship. Because being single isn't a waiting room for love. It can be a profound expression of autonomy, of personal truth, of conscious choice. We rarely talk about the richness that can come from a life built on internal alignment rather than external validation. We forget that joy can be cultivated through work that matters, friendships that feel intimate and safe, creative pursuits that nourish the soul, and solitude that teaches us how to befriend ourselves. These are not substitutes for a romantic relationship. They are essential elements of a deeply meaningful life. There's a term in psychology, self-actualization, coined by Abraham Maslow, which describes the process of realizing your full potential, of becoming who you truly are. Notice that nowhere in Maslow's hierarchy is a romantic partner required for this. Connection is, yes. Belonging is, absolutely. But connection and belonging can and often do exist outside the bounds of romantic partnership. This doesn't mean we discard the value of love, but we do need to widen our definition of it. Love isn't only found in someone choosing you as their partner. It's found in the friend who listens without judgment, in the creative project that stirs something in your spirit. In the mornings you wake up with clarity about your purpose, even if you wake up alone. One of the risks of placing romantic love at the center of fulfillment is that we start to see everything else as secondary. We minimize the importance of non-romantic relationships. We neglect our relationship with ourselves, and we delay our lives, putting off travel, big decisions, or personal dreams until we're partnered. But here's the truth. Your life is already happening, and you're allowed to live it fully now. Many people in relationships are still searching for meaning. Many married people feel alone. Many people who followed all the right steps still find themselves wondering why they feel numb, disconnected, or unfulfilled. So clearly, a relationship is not a cure-all. It's not the answer to every existential ache. This isn't about pretending you don't want love if you do. Desire is beautiful and longing is human. But there's a difference between wanting love and needing it to feel whole. The first is empowered. The second is conditional. And when your sense of worth is tied to whether someone chooses you or stays with you, you're not in a relationship, you're in a performance.